This is Between the Brackets, a MediaWiki podcast, episode 23, December 11th, 2018. Welcome to Between the Brackets. I'm Yaron Koren, and we're sort of closing out the year now with another high-profile interview. 2 episodes ago, I had on Håkon VM Lee, the inventor of CSS, and now we have Daniel Robbins, creator of Gentoo Linux and Funtoo Linux. Neither of those Linux distributions are quite as well known as CSS, but together they've seen a tremendous amount of usage. I also have a personal connection to Daniel. For several years, he was a consultant in my MediaWiki consulting company, WikiWorks, and he's welcome back anytime. And he was gracious enough to write the foreword for the second edition of my book, Working with MediaWiki, which came out last year. And he's currently the president of the consulting company BreezyOps, which we'll get to later. So, Daniel, it's great to talk to you again, and welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on your podcast.
I think I know the answer to this, but where are you now?
Oh, I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so, high desert out here.
Yeah.
Dusty. Just living the dream.
Yeah, my understanding is that even though you're from the windswept mesas of New Mexico, you're actually secretly Canadian, like a lot of actors in Hollywood. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, I was born in Canada. I'm not officially Canadian. I could pursue Canadian citizenship, but yes, I was born in Canada. I lived there as a kid and lived in Montreal, and then I moved to the States, as they call it, the U.S. When I was 8.
Oh, okay.
Visited often.
Yeah. Another one of those foreign interlopers.
Yeah.
So
I get to make Canadian jokes. That's
right,
my license.
Obviously, you're best known for your work with Linux distributions. I definitely want to talk about that, even though this is a MediaWiki podcast, because there are always interesting parallels and lessons to be learned from other open source projects, and maybe software projects in general. So,
yeah, definitely.
First of all,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. First of all, probably a lot of people listening don't know what a Linux distribution is or don't fully know, and I'm not sure I fully understand it either. I'm guessing people at least know what Linux is, but maybe not distributions. And actually, some people call them Linux distros. Do you call them distros or distributions?
I alternate, depends on the day.
Yeah, okay.
But what a Linux distribution is, I mean, basically, I think probably your listeners are familiar with open source software. MediaWiki is an example of open source software. And another example of open source software, or free software, as it's often called, is the Linux kernel. And there's all these different pieces, you put them together, and it makes a full operating system. And when you assemble all those open source components into an operating system, that's called a distribution. I mean, there's work that goes around creating a distribution. There's a lot of scripts and additional technology that we build to assemble it into a unified whole. And so Gentoo Linux is one of those distributions that I started. And it's known as a very significant distribution that is built from source, but automatically. So dependencies are automated. It's built from source. It's very flexible.
Yeah.
In fact, Google switched to using it to build Chrome OS. So it's the foundation of the software that runs on Chromebooks. So you can look at Chrome OS and think of all the different open source pieces that Google leveraged, plus some of their additional code. That's a distribution itself, in a sense, that was built on top of Gentoo Linux. So it's also possible to build your own distribution out of Gentoo.
Yeah. So that's interesting. How many people do you know, do you happen to know, or do you have any guess, are specifically using Gentoo or Funtoo? I mean, how many devices do you think those two together are installed on?
Well, I think it's thousands and thousands. When Gentoo actually started in around the year 2000, and I led it till about 2003, 2004. And during that time, it was number one on DistroWatch, which is sort of a community measure of popularity.
Yeah.
Since then, other distributions have really eclipsed it in terms of popularity, like Red Hat and Ubuntu. But it has like a loyal following of enthusiasts and very hardcore technical people because it can do stuff that other distributions can't. And that's why we call Gentoo a meta distribution. So it really gives you the power to, because it's built from source, you can have it make changes you want dynamically. Whereas like a distribution like Red Hat, they really have to make decisions for you because you're getting binaries from them, so precompiled software. So it needs to run on any 64-bit processor, for example.
Right.
Whereas Gentoo can be optimized for your specific processor. And then there's a lot of options in open source packages that you can only basically flip them on or off at compile time when you're building the software. So if you get something that's pre-built, the person who makes, or the company, organization that makes the distribution has to decide whether to flip that bit on or off for you. Like whether to enable a certain extension or capability in the software. Whereas with Gentoo and Funtoo, you have the ability to switch those on or off. And because it's built locally on your system, you can make a more minimalist system, or you can also enable more advanced features that might be available in the software. So it just gives people a lot of power and control.
Yeah.
The way I look at it, it's sort of like driving an automatic transmission car versus driving a manual.
Right.
Automatic transmission cars are easier to drive because, you don't have to do as much, but it also sort of pulls you away from the experience and gives you a little less control.
Yeah. Are there any other advantages to having I guess you'd call it a source code based distribution as opposed to a precompiled one?
Yeah, so definitely one of the big advantages is actually optimizing it for your specific processor. So Red Hat, Ubuntu, when they build binaries, they need to have them run on a generic 64-bit processor. But we've had 64-bit processors since about 2003. And every new generation of 64-bit processor, Intel Core, i7, or whatever that comes out from either Intel or AMD, they add new instructions, CPU instructions, that run more efficiently. But they're specific to that processor generation.
Right.
So GCC, the GNU C compiler, can take advantage of those instructions as long as you optimize the code specifically to run on that processor.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, Ryzen. There's AMD Ryzen optimizations in GCC. When you enable those, and you install on Ryzen, it runs faster than if you just took a normal distribution because it's using new instructions that are available on Ryzen.
Yeah. Okay. So that my understanding is Gentoo is the with a small g is the name of a very fast species of penguin, and I guess the reason for that is that Gentoo and now Funtoo have a big advantage in terms of speed. Yeah,
that was the name that somebody came up with. Gentoo was actually originally called Enoch. That was just sort of a name I picked.
Yeah,
it sounded impactful and biblical, so
sure.
I picked it. And we got to the point where we're like, well, this is not going to work as a general name. We need to find a new name. So one day, one of the people in my IRC channel came to me and said, hey, what do you think about Gentoo?
Yeah.
And we sort of discussed it, and he was like, it's a penguin too, and it's a fast penguin.
Right.
And we all sort of really liked it, so we switched to Gentoo.
That's very clever. Yeah, so you mentioned that it's running on Chromebooks. Not to belabor the question of popularity or the scope, but how many devices do you think overall, if you had to guess, are using your software in one way or another, whether directly using one of the distributions you created or something based on one of those?
Well, I think I'd have to look up the use of Chrome OS, but if you count that, I mean, it could be in the millions or approaching that.
Yeah.
just because Chrome OS is really like dominating in the education market.
Yeah.
Like a lot of schools, elementary, middle, and high schools are standardizing on Chrome OS because, it has enough power for kids to get their work done.
Right.
But not enough for them to like totally screw up their laptops and move off and play games.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Yeah. Right. It's sort of like the new OLPC, I guess. One laptop per child project. Yeah. Well, that's pretty amazing. I mean, to have that kind of impact. Briefly about Linux distributions. I mean, from what I understand, there's thousands out there, or maybe even more than that. Are people still creating new Linux distributions? I mean, I can understand if some new hardware device comes out, people might want to create a custom distribution just for that. But other than that, is there any reason to make a new one at this point?
Sure. I think creating a Linux distribution, first of all, it sort of proves the principles of open source, right? It's sort of like, I like the car analogy. If you build like a custom hot rod, you're basically using your engineering prowess. And
right.
I think that there's value in re-engineering things sometimes. So I definitely wouldn't say there's no point, because it can be a great learning experience. And there's also room for innovation. There's always room for innovation.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. So what were the years in which you were involved with Gentoo, and are you still involved with it in any way?
I'm not officially involved in any way. I was involved from its creation. I created basically all the core technologies and built the initial distribution and continued to lead the project up till I think it was around 2004, where I resigned from the project and sort of carried on with my regular life rather than my open source, I have 3 jobs and no income life.
Right. And then you created Funtoo. At what point did you create Funtoo?
Well, after Gentoo, I actually went to work at Microsoft for a period of time. Probably 10 years too early, because I was really there to sort of promote and advance open source efforts at the company. But at that time, Bill Gates was sort of out of the picture a little bit. Steve Ballmer was still kind of running things, and Microsoft really wasn't open to open source like they are now.
Yeah. Wasn't that was around the time they said that open source was un-American or something? I seem to remember some.
It wasn't right then. It was actually as they were trying to get Vista out the door and going through sort of the train wreck of Windows Vista.
Yeah. Okay.
There always have been people at Microsoft that are open to the idea of open source. They don't necessarily run the company or have any influence, and over time, they've I think helped to steer the company in a somewhat better direction.
Yeah. So then you left Microsoft and at that point you created Funtoo?
Yeah, so I wanted to, Microsoft really wasn't ready to do anything with open source. It was kind of disappointing at that time. So I wanted to get back into doing open source stuff, and I started playing with Gentoo again, of course. Of course, I didn't have any official position on the project. And I wanted to do stuff with Gentoo, but I found it frustrating whereas in the past, I was in charge of the project. I could say, hey, we're doing this, let's change that. I couldn't do that anymore. Other people were running the project. So I created Funtoo based on Gentoo. So I basically had the ability, because it was my own little ecosystem, to tweak whatever I wanted.
Right.
And the first thing I really wanted to get working was just a reliable builds of the operating system. At that time, Gentoo was really, really hard to build new releases of it. they were really focused on that. It's a rolling release distribution, which means they're continually updating packages. And I needed a build working for my, consulting work and just general server-related work. I wanted to get into cloud and hosting-related efforts. So
yeah, okay.
That's sort of how Funtoo started, and then just sort of blossomed from there into its own little independent project.
Is that the big difference between Gentoo and Funtoo? Funtoo on a technical level is the ease of setup or the number of steps involved?
Yeah, well, we've really optimized stuff a lot for, Gentoo has a reputation as being notoriously difficult to install.
Yeah.
So, it will put hair on your chest. That's a good thing. If you go through the process, but it can be a little painful. So we did some things to smooth that path. One of the biggest things is when installing Gentoo, you had to compile your own kernel. Well, that's actually can be incredibly complicated because you need to know what kind of hardware you have, what kind of peripherals you have, what options to enable. If you don't enable the right options, your system doesn't boot. So what we did is we actually took Debian's kernel and we built sort of a universally compatible Debian kernel that we ship with Funtoo. So when you install Funtoo, you don't have to build your own kernel. It comes with a pre-built kernel that supports pretty much all hardware.
Okay.
So that really made things a lot easier for users to install. And we've done other things, other advancements in our technology. Like we were the first to move to Git. Gentoo was really struggling to move away from CBS, and we moved to Git many years before they did. And we actually used Git to as a core technology within Funtoo to get updates to users.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of innovations that we've done in Funtoo land. Some of those trickle back actually into Gentoo.
Oh, interesting.
Because we have a pretty good relationship with the main developer of the package manager in Gentoo.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I want to backtrack a little and ask about why you left Gentoo Linux. You mentioned money. Was that the big part of it? Just the lack of funds coming in?
Actually, sort of yes and no. There was a lot of stuff going on at that time. So Gentoo really exploded in popularity. At around 2003, we had about 200 developers worldwide. So I was essentially responsible for managing that group of distributed developers.
Yeah, wow.
That was very challenging. And then there were tons of projects we were working on to advance Gentoo. So it was just a lot of work.
Yeah.
And Gentoo didn't have a financial model. It was a purely open source project. And actually, at that time, I was looking for ways to monetize. Monetize isn't the right word, but to generate revenue around Gentoo. But at that time, the climate in the open source world was really... There was not really this understanding that you could do open source and make money at the same time. In fact, people were afraid.
Right.
A lot of people in the open source community were really hostile to that idea because they thought it would compromise the integrity of open source and free software.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the world I was stuck in, where, a lot of the developers were really resistant to that. But of course, I needed to have an income.
Sure, yeah.
And basically, in the end, I just decided to set up a not-for-profit and basically then resign from the project.
Right.
And allow it to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, things have changed, but I'm not sure they've changed enough. I mean, there isn't the resistance to making money, I guess, that there used to be, but still, I think... well, at the very least, funding isn't given the attention that it needs. People don't talk about it enough.
Oh yeah, I mean, resource distribution is a huge problem, and I mean, if you look at like the Bay Area, you look at Silicon Valley, wealth is super concentrated in the upper echelons of these companies using open source. It's not really distributed
Right.
Equitably to the people who are often doing the work. I mean, the example I give people is, I tell people that I created the OS that Google used to create Chrome OS, and then I say, you know what I got? You know what Google has given me, right? Well, last year they sent me a blanket as a thank you, and a $50 gift card.
Oh.
I guess that's for living under the bridge to keep myself warm.
That's just insulting, I think.
Well, I'm sure it was done I'm sure it had the most positive, kindest intentions. They have an open source sort of thank you program that they do, and I got on the list, so they sent me that. But yeah, so when you look at the big picture, there's a real resource distribution problem, and it's not malicious. It's just they're so focused on making money themselves, and their company is not set up to distribute resources equitably to where they're needed.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's just a matter of being focused on making money. I think it's just not expected enough or something. I mean, a lot of these companies have, charitable wing that, they'll give money to help end poverty or whatever it is, end hunger or something. But there just isn't the sort of ingrained idea that you should be sending X amount or X percentage of profits or something back into the open source projects that you're benefiting from.
Yeah, it's not culturally expected at all. And that was really my ultimate goal with Gentoo, is really to find a way to do that, and then allow developers who are doing great work to be financially supported.
Yeah.
So in a sense, we never got there. The goal was to really get it sustainable so we could do it full time. And that's what I am focusing on with Funtoo. So I'm focusing a lot more on really, I would say it like this. I'm growing the open source side, but I'm also growing our financial model to be at the same level of maturity as the open source side.
Yeah.
So, for example, with Funtoo, we have infrastructure, we have servers and data centers. I offer supporters who do monthly support a container where they can run Funtoo Linux. So if you support the project with $15 a month, you get your own Funtoo Linux container.
I see.
And actually, that's been a really awesome way for us to raise funds and support the project. So I'm actually able to pay one of our developers a full-time salary. Now, admittedly, he's Ukrainian, so a full-time salary in Ukraine is much, much lower than a full-time salary in the US. But we're actually able to have paid staff.
Oh, that's great.
So that's pretty cool for a fairly small distribution to have that level of support.
Yeah. Are there also people giving money? Is there a Funtoo Foundation or whatever? Are there people just giving money to the project?
There are people giving money to the project, but there isn't a Funtoo Foundation, and we're not really actively going after fundraising. We're not a not-for-profit.
Oh, really? Okay.
We're just, we didn't go that not-for-profit route.
Right, yeah, you have to go through all the IRS process and everything.
Yeah, there's IRS stuff, and so many open source not-for-profits are not run well. It's a lot of work. People don't realize it. It sounds glorious, to have a not-for-profit, and then you actually look into the amount of paperwork you have to do, and then you meet with the board of trustees and then you end up dealing. The people who run the not-for-profit actually end up dealing with stuff totally unrelated to open source. There's just all this administrative overhead and dealing with copyright issues. And, it's very different. The skill of running a not-for-profit is a very different skill set than developing free software.
Yeah, I've looked into this quite a bit for Enterprise MediaWiki or some subset of it. There are some other alternatives like joining an existing foundation, whether it's an umbrella one like what is it, software in the public interest or something, or in your case, I guess you could maybe join the Linux Foundation. I don't know if you've thought about any of those things.
Yeah, there's different umbrella organizations.
Yeah.
It's something I'll consider. I really like keeping my options open regarding how to generate revenue. I think it's important. I'm totally willing to talk about making money and developing open source because I've lived that life where I've been kind of struggling to pay bills, but really doing some big stuff in the world of open source. So I know what that's like. And I'm sort of unashamed of trying to look for solutions that work.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing to try to do.
Yeah, I've to a more limited extent, I've certainly been in that situation, just dealing with the painful irony of it all, I guess. Thankfully, that's in the past for both of us. So actually.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, when we get into the world of wikis, there are organizations that can actually pay for work related to MediaWiki, which is nice.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue. I wanted to ask about MediaWiki. Well, first the technical aspects, and then I guess tying it all in. When did you discover MediaWiki?
So I think MediaWiki, I don't remember. It's not like there was a moment in my life where I discovered it, right? Yeah. I think MediaWiki is one of those things. If you're in the world of open source, if you're involved with technology to any degree, you're sort of aware of it. I mean, You're aware of it at the very least because of Wikipedia. And you also see it being used. So a lot of open source projects will use MediaWiki. So you're familiar with it. You get familiar with it just because it's out there.
Yeah.
I think probably the first time I started looking at it seriously was actually, so this was, I was running Funtoo post Gentoo days, and there was a wiki called the Gentoo Wiki, but it really wasn't, it was kind of interesting. The Gentoo developers in general were very anti-wiki. They weren't running the Gentoo Wiki. It was an independent project.
Oh, okay.
And the Gentoo developers didn't like it because it often, they would say, contained out-of-date information. So they were just like, this wiki, we don't like that. We don't really support this wiki.
Right.
You should use our official documentation. But then their official documentation never kept up with what the community needed, which was, covering a wider variety of topics. And, a wiki was just really appropriate for a distribution like Gentoo. So what I ended up doing, I looked at different wiki technologies, and I actually said, for Funtoo, we really do want to have a wiki.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to pick MediaWiki. So I got into MediaWiki. We deployed MediaWiki, and we actually made that our main site. So we didn't have like our own website and then a wiki. The wiki was our website.
Yeah, okay.
And it really is pretty much set up that way even currently. If you go to funtoo.org, you'll see our wiki.
Yeah.
What's interesting, though, is I found that the sentiment towards wikis in the Gentoo developer community started changing really rapidly when they saw that I had a wiki.
Oh, that's interesting.
Because, so what ended up happening is that I think then they realized, well, if Funtoo has a wiki, we really need to have an official wiki. And then there were some changes in their perspective towards wikis, and they chose MediaWiki and launched a really great wiki. So they launched an official Gentoo wiki running MediaWiki, and it's actually a really well-designed wiki. If you go to wiki.gentoo.org, it's definitely one to check out.
Yeah.
I think for the longest time, Arch Linux was the Linux distribution that really leveraged MediaWiki the most.
Oh, okay.
And I always saw that as a deficiency with Gentoo, and now I think Gentoo's wiki is really competitive with Arch Linux, and certainly from a design perspective has far surpassed Arch Linux.
Oh.
I mean, it's a very nice wiki. It has a custom skin. It's nice to look at, nice to use.
Cool. Yeah, and they're well, Gentoo and Funtoo wikis are both using some of my extensions, so I assumed there was some connection there. I guess it's just a matter of inspiration or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure I haven't actually looked at which extensions the Gentoo wiki is using, but we're using Cargo, for example, for the Funtoo wiki.
Yeah, that's great. What do you think about? Well, I guess maybe this is sort of redundant, but what do you think about MediaWiki as software? I mean, have you tried other wiki software or other CMS software like WordPress or Drupal, that kind of thing?
So I have a love-hate relationship with MediaWiki, as I think probably a lot of people who use it a lot do. MediaWiki is awesome when it is working wonderfully. It's that awesome user experience that people are used to from Wikipedia. There's a lot of skills that people can bring over if they're used to editing on other wikis. It's
Right.
very capable. There's tons of extensions that do tons of different things. It's really awesome in that way. And then, sometimes it can be challenging. Like recently I was dealing with an issue with the job queue.
Oh, yeah.
Which was causing issues. Like, have you ever dealt with bugs in the job queue?
I sure have.
Yeah, so that is a huge pain in the butt. And I don't know if maybe we should describe the job queue a bit. You want to go ahead and talk about what it is?
Yeah, sure. I think that's something that would interest a lot of people. Yeah, go ahead.
So how would you describe it?
Oh, how would I describe the job queue?
Then I'll go ahead and sort of I'll add some.
Well, at heart, it's
commentary
really
to
just a database table where each row is a job, and then they get run one at a time. Sort of the fancy way to call it would be asynchronously, but basically it's a way to call a lot of things without calling them all at the same time, and crashing the current operation or whatever.
Yeah, so like the underlying concept of the job queue is it exists because of the way PHP works. And the way PHP works is unlike a long-running process. The life cycle of PHP is actually just the period of time where it's serving the web request itself.
Right.
So Apache, you connect to a wiki, you load a wiki page, PHP starts up, it sends you the wiki page, PHP then dies, its life cycle is over.
Right.
So what happens if what you did with the wiki page resulted in additional work needing to be done? Well, one option is to keep that life cycle going longer, in which case your page will take a lot longer to load because it's doing additional behind-the-scenes maintenance work.
Right.
Or you can implement something like a job queue. So what the job queue does is you hit the wiki page. Let's say you edit the wiki page, you save the wiki page. You want to have a responsive wiki, but let's say you you added a category to a template, and there's 1,000 pages using that template. Well, now it needs to regenerate all those pages, update links all over the place. That could take several minutes of work. You don't want to be sitting there waiting for the page to finish loading during that time.
Right.
So what MediaWiki does is it creates all these jobs. It dumps them in a database table. It says, here's all this work that needs to get done at some point. And now that I've recorded this in the database table, we're good. And I can complete this web request and die. So that's what happens.
Yeah.
And then MediaWiki has this, I think the jury's out on whether it's ingenious or horrible, this system for running jobs. And the standard way it works is, so you load a page, and let's say every 1 out of 100 pages that someone loads, there's code in PHP that actually makes a callback to Apache internally to a special location, a special query, and says, hey, I am instructing you, Apache, and the PHP process that I am talking to run one of the jobs in the job queue. Right? That's sort of how it works, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know if Apache or the web service is involved. Maybe I actually don't know. There's still a lot
think
of jobs.
it goes through Apache, and PHP fires up and it says, "Oh, okay, you're requesting that I run a job." And then the whole asynchronous nature is that then you can basically hang up the phone, and that PHP process keeps running. It's set up to keep running, even sort of in the background. And then when it finishes, it has completed a job. So it's one of these things where it's sort of 1 out of 100 requests will send a request back to itself saying, "Hey, you need to run a job now." And then there's another way you can flush the job queue, which is to have an external job running script.
Right.
Which is a PHP script from the command line. You set it up. You can do it as a cron job or just have a script that keeps running. And what it will do is it will periodically look at the job table, and it will run jobs.
Right.
So it will flush out all those things. And there's all sorts of jobs. When you create an extension, you can create your own set of jobs that go in there. And it's for anything that can get done outside of the regular life cycle of a PHP web request. You can create jobs for it. But so long story short, I've had issues with the job queue because I found that if there's a bug in some of the code that runs in the job queue, jobs can get clogged in the job queue. They never get flushed, or MediaWiki thinks they're still running when they've actually died. So I've had issues like that that have been frustrating. So when you have one of those issues, MediaWiki can be very frustrating. But when it's working well, you can just focus on, your content and using extensions, and it's great. So that's sort of my love-hate relationship with MediaWiki.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good explanation of the job queue, actually, for anyone who wanted to know more about it. Hopefully that helps clarify things. So have you... I may have too much of a narrow focus because I really haven't dealt with other applications, wiki or otherwise, in CMS applications in a long time. But have you tried using WordPress or I don't know, SharePoint or Confluence or any of those, and have any thoughts on the comparison between all of those and how MediaWiki relates to them?
Yeah, I mean, to a degree. Like, I haven't used a recent version of WordPress. I know that it has a history of really huge security holes. It's sort of a pain to deal with if you host it yourself. So I always recommend that people really want to use WordPress to have someone else host it and maintain the software so you don't have to patch it all the time.
Okay.
Because it does require security updates. MediaWiki's strength is it gives you a paradigm that people are familiar with if they've used Wikipedia. It's sort of the standard, official, canonical kind of collaborative editing experience, and it just makes collaboration that much easier because it's what people are familiar with. Compared to what were some other ones you mentioned?
Well, there's the proprietary ones like Confluence and SharePoint, and then there's Drupal, Joomla, and all the wikis like TikiWiki and TiddlyWiki and everything.
Well, I've seen Confluence. It's pretty cool. It's a commercial product, so I think it seems pretty decent. What's your impression of it? Have you looked at it?
Yeah, I've looked at. I've been in organizations that use it. It's great for what it is. I think its big weakness is that it doesn't have templates, so which eliminates really the whole idea, the whole ability to define structures. Which I think that's one of the big strengths of MediaWiki is being able to have structures, and then if you use extensions like page forms, you can simplify editing and everything. So it's really just it's very good at what it does, but it's a lot more limited than MediaWiki, I think.
Yeah, my impression was it was sort of somewhere between Google Docs and a wiki.
Yeah, there's something to
Like,
that.
it doesn't really have the power, but I mean, it looks nice. It's pretty. You can use markup, I believe, or you have your like inline editor for stuff. But yeah,
Yeah,
it's not
Confluence
going to be
is
as
just
powerful.
HTML. There's no. I mean, you don't see the HTML. You're just seeing what's on the screen, but they don't have their own markup language.
Yeah. And then I think actually the real power of MediaWiki, a lot of it comes from some of the stuff that you're working on. I mean, you're maintaining page forms, right? And Cargo is definitely an incredible extension, and probably sort of a response to Semantic MediaWiki, I would think, right?
Sure. It's it's intended as an alternative. It's funny because this keeps coming up in the on the podcast. Usually, I'm the one to bring it up and to like try to force it into the conversation. But
and just to tell everybody, Yaron did not ask me to bring it up. I brought it up.
Yeah. Thank you. This is one of those rare cases where
You're welcome.
where the other person actually brought it up.
Yeah, I think Cargo is great.
Well, great, thank you. Yeah, but it's based very heavily on Semantic MediaWiki, and it's supposed to be a simpler, more lightweight alternative to it. But the basic concept all comes from Semantic MediaWiki.
Yeah, I mean, I remember we actually, we've done some consulting work together, and in the past, sort of struggling through with Semantic MediaWiki, which I think what we found was that people would do interesting things with Semantic MediaWiki. In a way, they would sort of abuse it and use it as sort of as a generic tool for building all sorts of weird things.
Right. Sure. Yeah.
Where I think Cargo is sort of a sort of a leaner, meaner version that is actually intended to be used to build those types of things. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. It's less prone to abuse.
Mm-hmm. And I think Cargo, Semantic MediaWiki is a cool concept, but I think it's almost built at too high an architectural level, building on top of MediaWiki. Whereas Cargo does very similar things, but you're hooking into MySQL directly, and I think that avoids a lot of issues.
Yeah.
But yeah, I remember there's so many wikis that I've seen where sort of Semantic MediaWiki can be like the worst thing to give people, because they'll take it and they'll start doing cool stuff with it, and then they'll create tons of crap. And that's also the problem with templates, right? Templates are this cool thing that you can use to do cool stuff on MediaWiki. And you can run into some serious performance issues if you don't know what you're doing with templates. Like you can have a template that you call on every single page, and you change that template and you have 30,000 pages. All those pages need to be regenerated, for example.
That is true, yes. Yeah.
Or you can have a template that gets called 100 times on every page, which can happen.
Sure, yeah. Yeah. That happens, well, the first of those at least happens on Wikipedia all the time, but they've got the resources to deal with it.
Yeah, definitely. And you probably are more familiar with how Wikipedia is set up, but
somewhat.
Yeah, they have a lot of they're doing a lot of tricks to get optimal performance.
Yeah.
On a lot of different levels.
Have you implemented MediaWiki? I mean, well, you've done consulting within consulting or anywhere else. Have you implemented MediaWiki elsewhere other than the Funtoo Wiki /homepage?
Yeah, I've set up wikis for lots of different organizations. So I have a consulting company called BreezyOps. It's at BreezyOps.com. And it's like WikiWorks. We do wiki consulting as well as other types of consulting. So if an organization needs help with a wiki, That's one of the services we provide. So I've set up a variety of wikis. Recently, I've been involved with some esports wikis, getting those running optimally, and actually switching from Semantic MediaWiki to Cargo.
Oh, cool.
Because they were having some serious issues with Semantic MediaWiki. It's one of those challenges where you give a wiki team templates and Semantic MediaWiki, they try to create all these amazingly cool things, and they don't realize that their wiki is getting slower and slower and slower, and eventually they get to the point where they, it's like the needle in the haystack. Well, that's not. It's the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right.
That's the metaphor I'm looking for. And all of a sudden, they have pages timing out, and they don't know what's happening.
Yeah, that definitely. Yeah, speaking of performance issues, that can that's definitely something that can happen if you have monster queries that you don't even realize are a huge performance resource hog or something. Yeah.
And then MediaWiki does have some good tools for tracking those down. Like you can turn on profiling, and you can see what templates are eating up the time on page rendering, and then you tackle those templates. So MediaWiki does have the tools to go in there and figure out where things are messing up and then fix it. So I've done work like that. So I'll give you an example of one of the technical issues that I had to deal with. So on this esports wiki, they were using a team template. So this would display a League of Legends team and its logo. And the way they implemented this template was they had a lookup table in the template of about 2,000 different teams. And they would pick the right team based on a huge case statement.
Oh, okay, right.
About like 2,000 teams. So you would basically call the team template with their abbreviation, and it would go through that case statement, find the correct team, and then render the full name of the team and their logo.
Right.
But they were using sometimes this template over 100 times on a single page.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So it was incredibly slow. So one of the ways that I got around that was I actually... we took all of the team information and we put it in a CSV file, and then we wrote a parser function extension that it would look up in PHP. It could parse the CSV file and quickly determine what team to output.
Yeah.
Because templates, if you do conditionals in templates, they're a lot slower than in PHP, and they can't be optimized by PHP at all. Really.
Right. Yeah.
So that resolved the performance issue, and that's one of the areas where we use the profiling functionality to debug profiling functionality to find out what was going on.
Yeah, cool. It hardly really matters, but this is just my my tech support side kicking in. But another option in that case is to there's an extension called, I think, just variables, where you can store a variable and then use it later on in the page. Store a value, but whatever works is good. Cool. So I have a question that I think ties into everything we've talked about. MediaWiki, Linux distributions, funding. So I guess you could make too much of this comparison, but there are what you could call MediaWiki distributions, which are software bundles that are MediaWiki plus various extensions. In some cases, there are custom modifications to core MediaWiki or those extensions. I know of about 5 to 10 of those. It seems like a pretty standard route at this point for MediaWiki consulting companies, actually, where they say we have software called Whammo or whammo. Sometimes they don't even say that it's basically just MediaWiki. Like you can't find that information on their website. And then they say, Whammo is great for government agencies or whatever the niche is, if there is one. Then the idea is people who download the software will pay some monthly amount to that consulting company for support, and then extra payments if they want any custom development or custom consulting. or training. That seems to have actually become the standard business model around MediaWiki, for better or worse. WikiWorks doesn't do that, but there are a bunch of companies that do, including some people I've interviewed on the podcast. Are you aware of that kind of thing, and do you see any parallels between that business model or that approach and Linux distributions?
So I'm somewhat aware of that model. This esports wiki, they were using a distribution of MediaWiki called Meza, I believe.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I talked to. That's a one that's not from a consulting company. That's mostly developed by these people at NASA who were on the podcast early on. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have mixed experiences with that approach. So the Meza install that was actually set up wasn't running well, mainly because there were some. Meza is a distribution of MediaWiki that includes semantic MediaWiki.
Right.
And in this case, semantic MediaWiki was kind of part of the problem. It wasn't offering the performance needed to implement some of the functionality that they were trying to do on this esports wiki. So we did need to move to Cargo. So based on that, I have some mixed opinions about, prepackaged MediaWiki derivatives.
Yeah.
My recommendation would be to try to use straight MediaWiki if possible. I understand why prepackaged derivatives of MediaWiki exist. There's definitely a need to test and integrate different extensions together and make sure they're working well for people.
Yeah.
And, you're adding value when you do that, when you're testing and making sure it's working. But it's the other side of the coin is you can potentially get kind of locked into that flavor of MediaWiki, and then it becomes harder to leverage sort of the entire MediaWiki ecosystem. Whereas if you stick with vanilla MediaWiki, you're generally in a better position to leverage extensions, and also, if you're an organization and you need help from another MediaWiki consultancy, they can help you more. You're not necessarily locked into more than a single vendor.
Yeah.
Though I would say that, as distributions of MediaWiki are becoming more common, MediaWiki consultancies are also becoming familiar with them. So you don't necessarily just have one place to go when you need support. You often still have, other places you can go for commercial support if you need it. I think the one thing I would just, I don't know. I mean, I personally wouldn't I like using vanilla MediaWiki and going from there, but I understand the benefits of sort of the pre-bundled stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's interesting. Definitely avoiding quote unquote vendor lock-in is always good. That's that's a big part of why open source is useful in the first place.
Yeah, you don't want to recreate that problem. So that's what you want to be careful of if you're an organization deploying MediaWiki. Then again, the Wikimedia Foundation is really focused on Wikipedia. They're not really focused on the independent users of MediaWiki. So what comes out from official releases isn't always 100% perfect for just Joe organization to go out there and deploy.
Yeah.
So, you want to leverage some kind of experience when deploying MediaWiki and using it in a production capacity, whether that's a prepackaged distribution of MediaWiki or someone who just has familiarity with the current state of affairs of the MediaWiki ecosystem, so they know what are the best extensions to use, which ones are being maintained, where the problem areas are. Because MediaWiki, the ecosystem is very dynamic. It's continually changing. An extension that was working great a year ago and was well maintained may not be maintained anymore.
Right.
An extension that might have been the best solution 2 years ago may not be the best solution today. There might be a better solution, and Cargo is a good example of that. So you really want to leverage that expertise. I would say that's my advice when deploying MediaWiki.
Yeah. Yeah, I should have mentioned one other thing, which is some of these bundles or distributions actually also include a data structure like templates and forms or whatever else within the wiki itself, which is another interesting aspect to them, I guess.
Yeah, it's sort of like they're creating their own component infrastructure using templates. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, do you know, this is something I've wondered about. Do you know if there are other open source applications that have similar kinds of things besides, I'm guessing Linux and MediaWiki aren't the only two examples, but I don't think I've ever heard of someone, repackaging MySQL with some other software, that sort of thing.
Well, I think it does happen. There are different versions of MySQL. Actually, there's MariaDB, which is like a pure open source fork. There's the official MySQL community, which is released by Oracle, and they have an enterprise edition as well. Then there's Percona, which is their own build.
Oh,
and
okay.
Percona is a consulting company as well. So they all have, like Percona has its own additions to MySQL that they test and deploy. They all have, like Percona has its own clustering solution that's different than what Oracle is offering. So it does happen. Yeah. It is something that happens in particular with MySQL.
Oh, that's interesting. I picked that as an extreme example of something that that's not packaged
That
at all, but in
didn't,
fact,
and then yeah,
all right,
yeah, it's happening there.
all right. Well, well, that's good to know. Actually, I didn't know about that. I knew about
And then when you look in
MariaDB,
the
but yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and then when you look in the cloud world, because we're living in a world where we almost have like a whole generation of technology users that are used to deploying stuff in the cloud now. That's just how they do stuff.
Right.
We have RDS is Amazon Web Services MySQL compatible implementation. So you can just spin up an instance of RDS and use that as if it were MySQL, and that's managed by Amazon Web Services itself. And there's similar offerings from Google Cloud Services. So yeah, it kind of that's sort of it's a big trend, definitely in software.
That's interesting. Is repackaging or providing. Well, I guess you could call it software as a service. All these different ways
exactly.
of accessing the same software. Yeah.
Yeah, and the cloud really is. I mean, AWS is becoming. It is huge, and it's becoming more huge.
Sure.
And we actually at Funtoo have decided to start supporting AWS. So we have official Funtoo AWS images.
Oh, wow.
That people can actually use. Yeah. Because we want to be where people are. So we realize that there's like a whole generation of people. That's how they do things. They do stuff in the cloud. And, Amazon Web Services has become sort of the darling of Silicon Valley startups. I mean, if you have a Silicon Valley startup and you're not using AWS, you're sort of scowled upon.
Yeah.
You're kind of expected to use AWS. And often VC people have, if you have VC money, you get like a couple $100,000 worth of AWS credits given to you for free.
Oh, okay.
To start your startup. So, yeah.
That's interesting. Is that an innovation on Funtoo's part? Are there other Linux distributions that do that kind of thing?
Oh yeah, there's definitely other Linux distributions that are in AWS. Gentoo historically has not really supported that. It's been really kind of difficult to get Gentoo running. There are images you can find, but they're not official images. So we wanted to create some official images. So we did that recently. And another interesting thing that's happening in AWS is, they've historically run a variety of Intel processors, and they just launched AMD EPYC processors, which are based on Ryzen. They're like Ryzen server processors. So they have instances that run on Ryzen, basically. And we have a version of Funtoo that's specifically built to be optimized to run on Ryzen and offer better performance. So that's actually available in AWS Marketplace.
Oh, wow.
And it's free.
Oh.
So you can I mean, Amazon will charge you, but we won't.
Right.
You can set up an instance in AWS running on Ryzen server processors. The AWS ones, the AMD ones are actually 10% less expensive than the equivalent Intel instances. So you save some money there, and you should get better performance as well.
Wow. Oh, cool. I think that pretty much covers everything, all my questions. We mentioned, of course, Funtoo and your consulting company, BreezyOps, and there'll be links to a bunch of links to things related to that in the page for this episode. Is there anything else you want to talk about or plug? Anything else you're involved with at the moment?
I appreciate all the plugs I can get. So thank you so much for those. I think that's it for me. Yeah, I don't have any more stuff to plug. I don't have any books coming out or anything.
All right, cool. Well,
I'm not in a movie that's coming out soon. So.
All right. Well, let me know, and we'll do another episode.
Yeah, when that happens, we'll schedule something.
Okay. Well, great. It was great talking to you, and thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being on your podcast. It was a lot of fun.
This has been another episode of Between the Brackets. I want to again thank my guest Daniel Robbins of Funtoo Linux and BreezyOps, not to mention Gentoo Linux. And thanks for listening, and see you next time.